Welcome to I Was Only Doing My Job, Australia's military history told through the stories of those who've served. I'm your host, Ross Manuel, and let's get started. G'day friends and welcome to the episode. Before we get underway, please be sure to check the podcast out on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter at IWODMJ and pop into the Discord server. The links to everything is in the episode description, where you'll also find the link to the show notes and photos about this and other episodes. Now that that's out of the way, let's get started. Normally, when it comes to topics for this podcast, I consult an ever-extending list of people or events that I have been planning and covering for the last 129 years of war and operations Australia has been involved in. But this episode actually came out following a chance encounter I had with a former colleague of mine on Instagram of all places that sent me down a rabbit hole ending in today's episode. So without any further ado, let's get started. Ernest Albert Corey was born on the 20th of December 1891 at the Green Hills homestead in Numarala near Cooma in southern New South Wales, which at 1,079 metres above sea level is actually the 8th highest homestead in New South Wales. He was the 8th of 11 children to Thomas Corey, a selector, and his wife Ellen Burke. He was educated at the Thurbergall Lake Public School. After finishing school, he undertook an apprenticeship as a blacksmith striker at Martin's Smithy in Cooma and was working in this job at the outbreak of the First World War. There have been several sources that make mention of his muscular physique, sculptured by his profession, and due to the dangers of his line of work, resulted in him undertaking a first aid course at the local St John Ambulance Division. These sources usually follow this description by mentioning his short stature. Now, as someone who, like Corey, is 5'7", I do take personal offense to the repeated comments that he was short, considering, at the time, the average Australian soldier in the First World War was 5'7" at the start of the war, and at the time of Corey's enlistment, the minimum height was 5'6". But that still made Australian troops much taller than their European contemporaries, so these statements are both unfair and inaccurate. By January 1916, Corey had moved to nearby Nimmertaville, a small town roughly 37 kilometres from Cooma, just in time for the 5th recruitment march to be announced, departing from the small border town of Delegate in southern New South Wales. Following the Gallipoli landings on the 25th of April 1915, the Minister for Defence, the Honourable George Pearce, yes, the same George Pearce behind the Emu War, set a monthly recruitment quota to all states of 5,300 volunteers to be able to maintain the AIF abroad, to which they committed to with gusto. While some states were able to routinely exceed this quota at the start of the war, and it quickly became a competition between the former colonies, it is interesting to note that Australia's most populous state, New South Wales, had the most difficulty filling their quota. While this might have something to do with the population density and dispersion of the first state compared to the other colonies, though the argument given at the time was that the recruiters weren't simply ready for the sheer number of New South Welshmen lining up to volunteer, so they were told to come back later. No matter how they spun it, it was a point of embarrassment, especially as they were being routinely upstaged by rival states Victoria and Queensland. Those colonial rivalries were as strong as ever. To remedy this, residents and shooting clubs in rural New South Wales decided to launch a series of so-called snowball marches, in which small groups of men would set out towards their nearest AIF training depot, and in doing so, as the name would suggest, act like a snowball rolling downhill and gathering snow as they went through rural communities in the hope of encouraging more suitable candidates to agree to sign up and join the march to a recruitment depot. The first of these marches departed Gilgandra in October 1915 and received considerable media attention, though the military was for the most part ambivalent to the concept. While they generated that news coverage, the 9 recruitment marches only managed to supply approximately 1,500 suitable candidates, and as a result didn't progress into the latter half of the war. The so-called Men from Snowy River March was under the command of District Area Commander, Staff Captain Frederick Robert Wedd, and had a planned route through the Monaro district of the Snowy Mountains, departing the Delegate School of Arts on the 6th of January 1916 with its final destination that was the country's first inland city of Goulburn and the city's AIF recruitment depot, meant to arrive on January 29. Now, if you were to put Delegate to Goulburn into Google Maps, it'll take roughly 3.5 hours by car on modern highways, or approximately 79 hours on foot, or just over 3 days. In 1916, it took the prospective recruits 3 weeks, marching roughly 22 kilometers per day along what is essentially the same route between the 22 towns and regional centers, stopping overnight on weekends for mass. I'll share the map of the route on the podcast Facebook page and on the website. Although volunteers joined the Snowies, as they were called, as they passed through smaller towns and villages, large civil receptions at the larger centres celebrated the Snowy recruits, which was intended to entice further eligible men to do likewise. For those men wanting to sign up, all they needed was to have a good pair of walking boots, a change of clothes, handkerchiefs and toiletries, and they'd be given a dungaree coat and trousers, white hat, a pair of boots, an overcoat, and a kit bag in which to carry their belongings. Captain Wedd had the authority to sign up any eligible man who volunteered, though the required medical examinations could only be done in the larger towns along the route, though they didn't actually officially join the AIF until they reached Goulburn. According to his attestation paperwork, Ernie Corey signed up at Nimtabel on the 13th of January 1916, and was one of the 50 men that departed the town to enthusiastic fanfare, which was much lower than what Captain Wedd had anticipated for the 59th mile of the march. His argument was that the eligible men were hiding behind the petticoats of women instead of doing their bit to serve. Perhaps the eloquence of Captain Wedd failed to inspire the men of the Monaro, or perhaps they were simply too practical, as one man from Cooma was quoted as saying, "I wanted to enlist, but I could not see the point of walking to Goulburn to do it, so he took the train instead." Another reason might have stemmed from the relative size of the towns in the region. Currently, most of these towns and townships along the route have less than 1,000 residents, and most at the time would have worked in agriculture, logging and mining, which were protected industries required for the war effort, so even if they wanted to join, they weren't allowed to. Corey and the 140 recruits of the march entered the AIF recruitment depot on the 29th of January at what is now the Goulburn Workers Arena, and were formally accepted into the Australian Imperial Force. He would be allocated to the 4th Reinforcements to the 55th Australian Infantry Battalion, along with the rest of the Snowies, and after a period of training at the Goulburn camp, he left Australia on the 4th of September that year aboard the HMAT A-15 Port Sydney, and arriving in Plymouth on the 29th of October. After additional training with the 14th Training Battalion at Herdcott on the Salisbury Plain, he would cross the English Channel aboard the Princess Victoria on the 21st of December 1916 on the way to France. He would, for some reason, forfeit 1 day pay for conduct in the prejudice of good order and military discipline on the 27th of January 1917, before arriving in Montauban to be formally taken on strength to C Company 55th Australian Infantry Battalion on the 8th of February as part of the unit's Grenadier section. He would enter the front line for the first time near Goedecourt that month, though his first experience at battle would be the capture of the villages of Doiners and Louisville on the 2nd of April 1917 with C Company. Following the battle, Corey and the rest of the 55th was reallocated to Labarque for rest and training, and in doing so would miss Australia's initial disastrous interaction with tanks during the First Battle of Bullecourt and the attack on the constructed German fortifications known as the Hindenburg Line, though he would get his chance. Despite the failure of the first battle, a second attempt to capture Bullecourt was planned for the 3rd of May 1917, while the British offensive around Arras continued, and after a bloody fortnight of bitter hand-to-hand trench fighting, it resulted in the Australian 2nd Division securing the town. On the 15th of May, the German army made their final attempt to dislodge the Australians from Bullecourt. However, they would fail and be forced to withdraw some days later, and in that battle, the legend of Ernie Corey would be born. The 5th Division, of which the 55th Battalion was a part of, was thrown into the battle a few days later to try and halt the German counterattack. Almost 7,500 Australians and over 8,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded during the Second Battle of Bullecourt, and as the casualties mounted, the commanding officer of the 55th Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Percy Woods, called for volunteers with first aid experience to act as stretcher bearers. One of those volunteers was Ernie Corey, and would go on to spend 17 hours retrieving the wounded and was instrumental in saving the lives of many men. On one of these forays, he encountered 2 Germans who were treating an Australian casualty. The startled Germans stood back in amazement as Corey allegedly approached them without a hint of fear or hesitation, then, under their very noses, gathered up the wounded Australian and headed back towards his own lines, while the confounded Germans simply looked on in bewilderment. It was acts such as this that was the reason why he was recommended and would receive the military medal for his actions. The citation read, "During the enemy attack on the front line facing Quente On the 15th of May, 1917, Private Corey, whilst acting as a stretcher bearer, showed great courage and devotion to duty. Although under direct enemy observation, he carried out his duties continuously for 17 hours without rest, and in a manner worthy of the highest commendation. Although an untrained stretcher bearer, he, together with the rest of the bearing party, saved by first aid the lives of seriously wounded men. The commander of the 54th Battalion wrote an appreciation for the help given, and specially mentioned the stretcher bearing party for their good work. Following this battle, the 55th went on to reserve trenches for a brief rest. He asked to be allowed to continue as a stretcher bearer, and in view of the mounting casualties, his request was granted. He showed the greatest care and compassion when treating casualties, but his method of transportation was rather unorthodox, particularly for someone of his stature. Again, he wasn't that short. He chose, instead of using a stretcher, to carry the men under his arms. Corey would receive his military medal in July, on the approval of Brigadier General Edwin Tivey, the same officer who collected George Giles's uniform. 3 months later, he would again be a stretcher bearer when the 55th Battalion was relocated to Ypres in Belgium to participate in the Battle of Polygon Wood. The Battle of Polygon Wood has previously been mentioned in 5 episodes, and was the name for the Australian component of the larger British and Dominion operation staged during the Third Battle of Ypres, comprising of 7 British and 2 Australian divisions, advancing over an 8.5-kilometre front starting on the 22nd of September 1917. The battle itself was the second of a series of well-planned, limited advances supported by artillery orchestrated by British General Herbert Plummer. Australian forces advanced under a heavy artillery barrage, which accounts referring to the noise as compared to a raging bushfire, and was referred to by official Australian correspondent Charles Bean as the most perfect that ever protected Australian troops, with smoke so thick that it required the assault troops to use compasses to maintain direction. By the end of the first day, the Australian divisions had secured their objectives, and with some difficulty from dogged German defenders. These positions were then held against a determined counterattack. But like the Battle of Bullecourt, casualties were high, with British and Dominion forces sustaining over 15,000 casualties, of which 5,770 were Australian. And once again, Corey entered the front line as a stretcher bearer, and in doing so, he was recommended for the Distinguished Conduct Medal. But for reasons unclear, the recommendation would be downgraded, and he would instead receive a bar to his military medal. The citation would read, "This stretcher bearer showed great courage, devotion to duty, and untiring energy during the attack on Polygon Wood on the 26th of September, 1917. The greatest danger did not deter this man from doing his duty when his services were required, and he tended the wounded and carried them to places of safety continuously throughout the engagement, often under heavy artillery and machine gun fire. Throughout the whole operation, he set a fine example of bravery and coolness to all ranks." Now, a medal bar, otherwise known as a medal clasp or device, in this context is a thin metal bar attached to a ribbon of a military decoration. It most commonly indicates the campaign or operation the recipient received the award for, or for reaching career milestones, but in particular in regard to Ernie Corey, actually referred to the multiple awards of the same medal. So instead of having multiple medals, you have a bar instead. Following the Battle of Polygon Wood, the battalion would enter reserve positions in France and Belgium to train, reinforce, and recover, with the occasional rotation to the front lines. During the winter of 1917-1918, the 55th Battalion was posted to the Messines sector, and Corey was granted leave to the United Kingdom in February 1918. While on leave, he became ill with a venereal disease and spent 90 days in hospital before rejoining his battalion on the 8th of June as it was in Corps Reserve positions for a period of rest before joining the line at Salay-le-Sec in northern France. During the successful joint Australian-American attack on Hamel on the 4th of July 1918, which I covered with War Stories host Preston Stewart back in Season 1, the 55th, along with the rest of the 14th Brigade, provided support to the attack, with the 55th Battalion carrying out a feint around the commune of Salay-le-Ret. When the Allied 100 Days Offensive began on the 8th of August, with attacks around Amiens, which ultimately broke the deadlock on the Western Front, 55th Battalion was initially not involved, although it did serve as a divisional reserve. Withdrawn from the front on the 9th of August, the division rested around Villers-Bretonneux before being recommitted to the fighting. Following the German retreat to the Somme near Péronne and the protection of the Hindenburg Line, on the 31st of August, the 2nd Division attacked Mont-Saint-Quentin, with the 5th Division stood ready by to exploit any opportunity to cross the Somme River Valley and take Péronne. On the 1st of September 1918, the 14th Brigade, the only 5th Division Brigade that had been able to find a way across the Somme in late August, captured the woods north of the town and followed it up by taking a main part of it. British General Henry Rawlinson later described the Australian advances on the 31st of August to the 4th of September through Peronne and Mont-Saint-Quentin as the greatest military achievement of the war, and it was in this time that Corey once again stepped up to the plate. The casualties were heavy and the stretcher bearer's work seemed endless. Bert Bishop, who was also a C Company soldier who assisted Corey treat a wounded man during the fighting at Peronne, stated, "Ernie quickly inspected the damage." He later wrote, "One of the wounded men's arms was attached to his body by a single sinew of muscle. He was bleeding badly. Ernie took a blade razor from his breast pocket, opened it. 'Here,' he told me, 'hold the arm straight from the shoulder.' He cut through the sinew and got busy trying to stop the bleeding by bandaging the stump and soaking it in iodine. Uncertain what to do next, Bishop dropped the arm and returned to battle. Apparently, the wounded soldier then asked Corey for a favour. 'Go back and get my arm,' he pleaded. 'On the third finger, there is a ring my wife gave to me. Save it for me.' Corey retrieved the arm, but had trouble getting the ring off the finger, so he brought it back to the support platoon, carrying it, quote, 'like a leg of mutton underarm, blood still oozing out,' unquote. Unsurprisingly, he had trouble getting anyone to help him pull the ring off, so Ernie, apparently renowned in the battalion as a bit of a joker, quote, 'took out a razor and really severed the finger at the appropriate point and jubilantly slipped the finger off, exclaiming, "I learned the trade killing rations sheep on a station," unquote. The battalion medical officer commended Corey for his careful handling of the wounded and his first aid skills, which he believed saved the lives of many men. But he couldn't save them all. As the fighting died down, Bert Bishop saw Corey carrying a man and placing him in a line with other bodies. Corey returned to the field and picked up another body and dragged it in. "Can't find any more wounded," he said despondently. "Look at it, Bert, a whole field of dead men." Once again, for his characteristic determination, skill and courage, Corey was recommended again for a Distinguished Conduct Medal, but, unsurprisingly, for reasons unknown, it was downgraded a second time and he received a second bar to his military medal. This third citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty during operations at Peronne on the 1st and 2nd of September 1918, this man, who was a stretcher bearer, dressed and carried wounded of several units throughout the whole operation. Although the enemy artillery and machine gun fire was exceptionally heavy, this did not debar Private Corey from carrying on. He worked continuously and arduously and was the means of saving the lives of many wounded. He was most unselfish throughout and cheerful at all times and under all circumstances. His conduct was a great example to all his comrades. His careful handling of the wounded and his knowledge of first aid helped greatly to relieve their sufferings. He is a fine example of courage, coolness, and devotion to duty under heavy fire." By the end of September, the German army had withdrawn completely to the Hindenburg Line, and in order to shorten their supply lines. In response, the 5th Division was put in line against the Hindenburg Line in what would become the second last Australian operation on the Western Front, though at the time there was still the very strong possibility of the war continuing on to 1919 or even 1920. On the 20th of September, Corey would be promoted to corporal and placed in charge of the 55th Battalion's stretcher-bearer parties. 9 days later, the 5th Division would conduct their last attack of the First World War, an attack on the Hindenburg Line at Bellecourt. The objective was to break through one of the most heavily defended stretches of the Hindenburg Line, which used the St. Quentin Canal as part of its defences. This would also end up being the last time the Australian Imperial Force would work alongside the American Expeditionary Force after their first collaboration during the Battle of Hamel. And it was in this battle that the Americans outnumbered the now severely depleted and exhausted Australian forces. The intention of the attack was that the two American divisions, the 27th and the 30th, would break through the Hindenburg Line, and the Australian divisions, the 3rd and 5th, would leapfrog them and continue on to reserve areas. Unfortunately, as the battle progressed, the inexperience of the American troops started to show. A US operation launched to secure the start line on the 27th of September was unsuccessful as dugouts and trenches had not been properly cleared out. The same mistakes were repeated by the 27th Division when the actual attack was launched. The 3rd Australian Division, trying to advance to its own start line, became embroiled in the fight for the Americans' first objective. With all of the tanks intended to be used in the operation either destroyed or disabled, and uncertain positions of forward troops preventing the use of artillery, the battle degenerated into a struggle for individual strong points, fought with bombs, bayonets, and Lewis guns, lasting for another 3 days. The 30th American Division, attacking further to the south, was more successful, enabling the 5th Australian Division to pass through and capture the heavily fortified village of Bellecourt. Their progress, however, was hampered by the lack of success in the north. Despite the glowing praise Monash gave the Americans at Hamel, 3 months later he was extremely critical of them, writing, quote, "In this battle they demonstrated their inexperience in war, and their ignorance of some of the elementary methods of fighting employed on the French front. For these shortcomings they paid a heavy price. Their sacrifices, nevertheless, contributed quite definitely to the partial success of the day's operations," unquote. While the assault eventually achieved its objectives, resulting in the first full breach of the Hindenburg Line, in the face of heavy German resistance, it did so with heavy casualties on the Allied side. Corey, now with the responsibility of directing the work of the stretcher-bearers. Although the battlefield was swept by German machine gun fire, the stretcher-bearers were sent out into no man's land to rescue wounded soldiers, including the American forces. At one point during the fighting, Corey noticed 2 German stretcher-bearers beckoning to him. They had a wounded soldier of the 55th Battalion on a wheeled stretcher, but he was too heavy for them to move. The soldier had lain out on the battlefield all night with a wound in his back which had been bandaged by the Germans. Ernie picked him up in his arms and carried him 50 yards to a shell hole, telling him he would return later. The Germans took their stretcher and waved goodbye to Corey. However, Corey's luck ran out that day. At 11 a.m., he spotted his company commander lying in an exposed position, trying to control the flow of blood from the stump which was once his leg. He once again ran out into no man's land in the direction of the wounded officer. Scurrying from shell hole to shell hole, he crossed the open ground, crawling the last 50 meters or so to reach the officer's side. Corey wasted no time applying preliminary first aid to the man's shattered leg. Suddenly, he was hit by shrapnel, though sources are unclear if it was artillery or machine gun fire that ripped into Corey's body. Bleeding from a thigh and the femoral artery, he managed to gather his wits about him and recovered his medical bag satchel and managing to apply a tourniquet to staunch the bleeding to allow him to dress the gaping wound now in his thigh. Both men knew that they would have to move before they became victims of more incoming fire. Helping each other to their feet, they stumbled, crawled, and scrambled back to safety of their own trenches before being picked up by other stretcher-bearers. Evacuated to a casualty clearing station, Corey was operated on before receiving a transfer to a general hospital in Le Havre. Operated on again, he was sent to a hospital in Bristol, England. As he lay in his hospital bed, Corporal Ernie Corey learned that he'd been awarded a 3rd bar to his military medal, and in doing so would be the only person in the history of the British Empire and later Commonwealth to ever receive the military medal 4 times, an achievement that to this day has not been duplicated. His 4th citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty as HCO in charge of battalion stretcher-bearers during the attack on the Hindenburg Line north of Bellecourt on the 30th of September 1918. Although the enemy machine guns and shell fire were intense, this gallant NCO directed the operations of the battalion stretcher-bearers with the utmost skill and bravery. Regardless of personal danger, he, on numerous occasions, although the enemy were firing upon him and other bearer parties, attended to men and carried them to the utmost positions. His efforts were untiring, and he set a splendid example to all ranks until he was severely wounded. It was mainly due to his magnificent work that the wounded were safely removed from the danger zone. He was still in hospital when the armistice was declared on the 11th of November and would be repatriated to Australia on the 30th of April 1919 aboard the troop ship SS Plassey. He'd be medically discharged at the end of June that year. On his return to Australia, and after a brief period of recuperation, which by all accounts, Corey returned to a modest life. He could have exploited his position as being the most decorated soldier in the British Empire, but instead he showed the same modest, humble life that he had before the war. He would go on to work as a contract rabbiter around Cooma until 1922, when he moved to Canberra, living at Westlake and later at Downer, when he worked as a camp caretaker. On the 23rd of September 1924, at St Gregory's Catholic Church, Queanbeyan, New South Wales, he married Sarah Jane Fisher, and the couple would welcome their only child, a daughter, Patricia Merle Corey, in 1929. Sadly, the marriage would be dissolved in 1935. Between 1927 and 1940, Corey worked in a number of jobs in Canberra, Goulburn and Queanbeyan, including doing a stint as an office cleaner for the then Department of the Interior. At the commencement of the Second World War, 48-year-old Ernest Albert Corey travelled to Paddington to enlist in the Australian Military Force and was taken on strength with the 13th Garrison Battalion before being assigned to the 2nd Garrison Battalion to defend the critical Port Kembla steelworks, the same steelworks that was responsible for the development and manufacture of the Owen gun. Corey would list his 12-year-old daughter Patricia as his next of kin and would work in the garrison's regimental aid post. By all accounts, it would seem that he downplayed his 4 military medals, as his paperwork makes no mention of them. He would serve for 2.5 years before finally hanging up his uniform for good after being medically discharged due to having asthma. He then went through a series of jobs, including employment as a caretaker at the Canberra Services Hut in Monica, a cook for the Departmental Survey Party, and the leading hand at the Canberra Incinerator at the Westbourne Woods. In the 1950s, Corey's health had begun to deteriorate, and by the 60s, he was no longer able to look after himself. Crippled with arthritis and confined to a wheelchair, he moved to the Queanbeyan Private Nursing Home, where he lived the remainder of his life until he passed away on the 25th of August 1972 at the age of 80. He was survived by his daughter Patricia, and he was buried with full military honours in the ex-servicemen section of the Woden Cemetery. Before his death, he was interviewed, and he took great pride in knowing that he was decorated for saving lives and not killing them, and in fact claimed that he never fired a single shot in anger. Corey's impressive medal rack is currently on display in the First World War Gallery of the Australian War Memorial, along with his helmet, which had been painted chronicling his service in the Great War. I'll include photos to the podcast's social pages because it's something that I can't describe to give it proper justice. It was either painted by Corey himself or someone for him, and appears to have been painted all at the same time, which, given the inclusion of the reference of his 3rd bar to the military medal, indicates that it had been painted in Australia after June 1919. Now, there is a question that has popped up, namely in all the recommendations and achievements that Corey received during his career, including his first citation that stated that Corey acted, quote, in a manner worthy of the highest commendation, unquote, that why he was never awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest award for gallantry and bravery, instead was awarded the military medal 4 times. And let's not get started on the whole why was his recommendations for the Distinguished Conduct Medal downgraded too, but I digress. In 1978, the Cooma Monaro Historical Society did in fact inquire to the Central Armed Records Office, or CAIRO, if Corey had ever been recommended for the Victoria Cross, based on a claim made in his obituary. And, much like Bull Allen, commentary has been made that Corey should have been awarded the VC for his actions, but he was disqualified in his capacity of being a non-combatant. There have been a few articles that directly state this, and I've heard this commentary so often that I even started to believe it. Until, of course, with my chance conversation with my former colleague, historian Aaron Pegram, co-author of the book For Valour, Australians Awarded the Victoria Cross, who set me down the correct path. On the 29th of August, 1916, the Australian Imperial Force, along with the rest of the British Imperial Forces, received instructions from General Headquarters that changed the criteria for which actions would be considered eligible for the Victoria Cross, stating, quote, in future, the VC will only be given for acts of conspicuous gallantry which are materially conducive to the gaining for victory. Cases of gallantry in life-saving, however, finer nature, will not be considered for the VC, unquote. Instructions would follow in subsequent months that further explain this policy shift to ensure, quote, that the rescue of wounded should not interfere with the use of every available man for any operation, to avoid unnecessary loss of life, and to discourage attempts to win honours for the sake of it, unquote. However, in my own reading of these instructions, brings me to an issue that has faced wargamers the world over. The adage of rule as written versus rule as intended. Because while the first general instruction states, quote, cases of gallantry and life-saving, of however finer nature, will not be considered for the VC, unquote, an additional instruction received the following month states, quote, in future, the Victoria Cross or other immediate reward will not be given for the rescue of the wounded, excepting to those whose duty it is to care for such cases, unquote. On one hand, the first instruction implicitly states that the recovery of wounded wouldn't be eligible for the VC. The second states that the first instruction only applies unless it's the soldier's duty to care for such cases, especially as the military medal is also considered an immediate reward, which was routinely awarded to medical personnel. In either rate, the AIF apparently took the first instruction as gospel, as from September 1916, actions for which the Victoria Cross was awarded were distinctly more aggressive than those that came before it, especially the first 5 Victoria Crosses awarded to Australians in the Boer War, which were attending to wounded soldiers. Whether the AIF headquarters was more discriminatory in its execution of this instruction compared to other Imperial forces is unclear. However, it is evident after a cursory inspection of the Victoria Cross recipients from after Field Marshal Haig's instruction that those forces didn't adhere to it so liberally, as there were numerous instances of soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force and other Dominions acting in other than direct combat roles, including medical officers, stretcher bearers, and even a bagpiper being invested with the highest award for gallantry. What is known, however, that there is no evidence of any conversation at any point within the 55th Battalion, the 14th Brigade, or the 5th Division in regard to awarding Corey the Victoria Cross. And if there was, it was never recorded. And to take an adage from a previous life of mine, if it wasn't written down, it didn't happen. This is despite many of the diggers of the 55th Battalion insisting that he should have received the VC at least once. As for the obituary that stated he'd been nominated, I suspect this might have been a misremembering of his recommendation for the 2 Distinguished Conduct Medals. Now, did Ernie Corey deserve the Victoria Cross? Definitely. Much like Bull Allen, he was equally deserving for the award and should have had at least one of his military medals upgraded. However, unlike Bull Allen, there doesn't appear to be much momentum in trying to change his citations, as he was not included in the 2013 review of Unresolved Defense Honours, which saw Teddy Sheehan awarded the Victoria Cross for actions in the Second World War. Considering that most articles written about Ernie Corey include the phrase, the forgotten hero, exemplifies the fact that this stretcher bearer from the Southern Highlands and the Monaro of southern New South Wales exemplified the phrase, I was only doing my job. But Ernie, for your service in saving the lives of many men, I and those you rescued will be forever eternally grateful. Thanks for listening to the I Was Only Doing My Job podcast, a Doc Network production. This episode was written, produced, and audio engineered by me, Ross Manuel, with additional research done by Laurie Favell. I'd really appreciate it, and it would help out the show if you took some time to share this with a friend, or leave a review on Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or iTunes, or anywhere that you listen to podcasts, as it really helps other people find the show. If you want to know more about today's episode, with photos, show notes, and transcripts, head to www.thedocnetwork.net and follow the show on IWODMJ on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Don't worry, there's a link in the show notes. If you want to follow me for history-related hijinks and other nerdery, you can follow me on practically everything at Doc Winters. Once again, thanks for listening and catch you next time. Bye!